And joining us now is Emily Channell-Justice, who's the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine Program at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, a sociocultural anthropologist who has been doing research in Ukraine since 2012. Her current research focuses on political activism and social movements among students and feminists during the 2013-2014 Euromaidan mobilizations. Welcome to Background Briefing, Emily Channell-Justice.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us, Emily. And what are you hearing from your many contacts in Ukraine now, particularly in Kyiv? It seems like these talks on the Belarus border were something of a ruse on Putin's part to distract from the military build-up, and he's sort of sent in his B team first, a lot of conscripts, and they were sort of testing the Ukrainians, and they've been chewed up pretty badly, apparently. But now he's sending in the A team. So it's pretty grim, is it not?
It is grim. I think the immediate response from the Ukrainian side has been much more than many people anticipated, and that includes Vladimir Putin. I think he incorrectly assumed that many people in Ukraine would welcome him with open arms, and that's not happening anywhere, even in the places that he anticipated being kind of more pro-Russian than others. And so he's been kind of forced to recalibrate, and to use up more aggression than maybe he thought was going to be necessary. That's not a good thing, but at the same time, it's showing resilience on the side of the Ukrainians that is I don't know, inspirational. Is that the right word? I mean, they've really shown that they're not going to let their country go easily by any means.
So do you think Putin actually believes his own propaganda that Ukraine is run by a bunch of Nazis, even though the president is Jewish?
I think he does to some extent. I don't think his propaganda is based in much reality, but I don't think there's anybody in his immediate circle there to tell him that what he's telling himself is not true. And so it's very possible that he absolutely believes what he's saying. I mean, we know that he's used that narrative that Nazis took over the Ukrainian government in 2014. You know, he's used that narrative in Russia for a long time. Now it looks like that was in preparation for this moment, for that justification. I mean, President Zelensky's response, his first speech in response was so eloquent, you know, talking about his own family's sacrifice for the Red Army, for the Soviet army. You know, we know from watching more than Russian TV that those narratives are false, but Putin has an echo chamber around him.
Well, you know, I really wish the US had a better ground game in terms of counter-propaganda, because clearly soft power would be really helpful in... I mean, I think the Russian people know that they're being sold a bill of goods, don't they? I mean, they're pretty cynical because they've been bombarded with state-controlled propaganda for decades. What's your sense on how much they believe, even though we're told at least 50% of the country support Putin and the invasion?
Well, that's what we're told. I think you know, we haven't had. It's hard to get, you know, good polling data from Russia. We know that much of it can be manipulated, and so it's hard to say. I just heard some numbers today that were based on trusted academic sources that had a number of around 8 to 9% of people that really supported an out-and-out war with Ukraine. That's Russians who would support a war with Ukraine. 8 to 9%. That's a tiny fraction of the actual population.
Absolutely.
So I think the disconnect here that we have to keep in mind is the Russian people who don't necessarily support an aggressive, violent invasion versus those who still believe that Ukrainians and Russians are brothers or are the same. You know, what's the position? What's the point of potential dissent within that? People who, okay, maybe they believe that Russians and Ukrainians are the same, but they aren't willing to use violence to sacrifice their own selves, their children, their parents in order to get that back. That's the kind of crack, I think, that we have to look for. It's very possible that number who isn't willing to use violence is much larger than we've anticipated. And we have seen a lot of, you know, anti-war protests on the streets in big cities in Russia, maybe certainly more than Vladimir Putin anticipated.
And again, I'm speaking with Emily Channell-Justice, who's the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine Program at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, a sociocultural anthropologist who has been doing research in Ukraine since 2012. Her current research focuses on political activism and social movements among students and feminists during the 2013-2014 Euromaidan mobilizations. So you know the Ukrainian people very well, Emily, and a lot of talk about their bravery, and it's pretty obvious. This is a David and Goliath situation. And there's also talk about a guerrilla war. How much is this sort of wishful thinking on the part of the West? Because I imagine there should be, and maybe there is, a certain element of guilt amongst Western and NATO leaders that they've really not come to Ukraine's aid when they should have. And the Ukrainians are clearly doing all the fighting. And let's face it, the Ukrainians are fighting for democracy. And here in the United States, we're losing our democracy through massive Republican voter suppression. We have a former president who's openly siding with Putin, and he could come back in 2024. So we're not exactly in a very healthy situation vis-a-vis democracy. But the idea that the Ukrainians are standing up for democracy on their own is kind of heartbreaking.
It is, and that, yeah, I think you framed it exactly right. I mean, Ukrainians are willing to give up everything to keep their country alive. I mean, we know that Ukrainian democracy isn't perfect, and as you've rightly pointed out, American democracy is far from perfect itself. So what they're fighting for is an idea, as it's an identity. It's so much more than than joining NATO or something like that. It's intangible. And I think that's what motivates people to keep fighting. I do fear that this could become a long and drawn out resistance. Obviously, I say that I fear that because I think it would entail a lot of violence and a lot of death. I think, we're already seeing large numbers of civilian casualties. That number is going to continue to increase as long as it draws out. But Ukrainians are not going to back down. I mean, President Zelensky, I'm sure, went into these talks today knowing that there's not anything he's willing to give up in order to get concessions. And so I don't know if it's heartening. I don't think that's really the right word. It's very moving to see people who are willing to fight. And those people who aren't willing to take up arms, I should point out, they're in the background. They're helping people get medical supplies, get food. They're helping refugees leave the country. They're helping foreigners who were stuck in Ukraine get to the borders and get to safety. So even the people who you're not seeing taking up arms, they're also doing something to help. They're staying in Ukraine. They're risking their lives to stay in Ukraine to do that.
So these scenarios for guerrilla war, whether or not they're exaggerated, it would seem to me that given how many troops Putin would need for an occupation, he certainly doesn't even have that number. He'd need about 500,000. So again, is his military planning based upon his own fantasies about that he's liberating the Ukrainian people as opposed to enslaving them?
I think so. I do think that and this is actually kind of where the fear really is rooted. I think he did expect many people, especially in those border regions, to greet Russian troops with open arms. They have not. They are fighting. So like you already said, he has to bring in this A team, which he doesn't really probably want to do. But that means he also may ramp up some of the other kinds of aggression. And so, that means more indiscriminate bombings that may impact civilians even more, right? Much more aggressive use of force in some of the areas where we hadn't yet seen that. And so I think the fear is that instead of learning from this negative reaction on behalf of Ukrainians, instead of recalculating to say, okay, maybe I'm wrong, he's going to instead ramp up the violence and aggression. As we've seen, he's ramped up the nuclear threats as well to anybody who gets involved. So the fear is, how do you respond to counter somebody whose initial response to people not accepting his invasion is to be more aggressive? I think that's a scary prospect.
Well, apparently he's deployed the Wagner Group, which is the mercenaries run by this guy Prigozhin, Putin's chef, and they're very active in Africa where they're doing horrible stuff. They're really nasty people. And apparently they're already in Kyiv. At least Zelensky has warned that there are these assassination groups out in Kyiv trying to assassinate him and his family, along with other key leaders. So it's got to be incredibly scary for the Ukrainians to not just to defend the perimeters of the cities under the assault, this growing assault from the Russians, but also having this kind of fifth column within their cities and within their country.
Absolutely, and we saw a threatened coup plot a few months ago that was sort of seemed a little, I don't know, out there to me, but now obviously seems very connected to what's happening now. And we actually, a panelist at an event I was at earlier today mentioned there was already a coup on Zelensky's life months ago. It was a very strange kind of bungled assassination attempt. It didn't go anywhere, but now we're starting to put these pieces together and see how much of this has been in the works. And so I think going back to what you said, this is kind of putting in the A team. I mean, the Wagner Group has a ton of experience doing ruthless things. It won't surprise me at all if they're trying to infiltrate Kyiv. I hope, and I mean, I know that the Zelensky government has made that information very public. They've said we're looking out for saboteurs. There's lots of information circulating about people, Russian military coming in and having on Ukrainian military uniforms. And there's a lot of, information circulating to help people understand what the saboteurs are doing. But it's very scary to see that level of premeditation and that level of aggression. Especially when the response, again, the response of Ukrainians is clearly that they do not want a Russian-led government.
So in terms of the morale of the Russians, because they've been lied to, and there have been sort of anecdotal scenes and some video clips of ordinary Ukrainian citizens confronting Russian soldiers. And there was a Russian tank broke down on the outskirts of Kyiv, and a motorist was driving by, a civilian in his car, and he rolled down his window and said to the Russians on the tank, "Do you want a tow?" And they all broke up in laughter, and the Ukrainian said, "Yeah, I'll tow you all the way back to Moscow." So you hear these stories, and you hear also about the conscripts being ill-trained, ill-fed, ill-equipped, and there's at least 200 or 300 have been captured already. Can that sort of work on a larger scale? Could it work if there is some kind of occupation? Would there be this? I mean, it happened in 1968 in Czechoslovakia when the Soviets invaded. The young Czechs took to the streets and they all spoke Russian, and they really, these poor conscripts on the tanks they thought they were liberating the country, and then they were quickly corrected by the Czechs. Could the same thing happen in Ukraine?
I certainly think so. We're seeing the example that you gave. I've seen several more things like that. In the southern port city of Berdyansk, we saw videos of people, Ukrainians, out in the streets right in front of the Russian occupiers, telling them to go home, and large crowds. So I think that morale question is important because Putin is ramping up these kind of ruthless campaigns, but he's asking people who clearly are out of their element and very likely do not believe in those things to do that. And also what we're seeing is, Ukraine is not going to back down, which means that an occupation of the major cities is going to be that much more difficult. And so if you have all of these competing elements and you don't have, like you said, 500,000 troops who are willing to believe in this, we have to hope that that creates an opening, for Ukraine to have a little bit more time and for more aid to get through. I think there is a risk in that case of a very protracted kind of guerrilla resistance, and that's going to result in just so many casualties. And I hate to think like that. But at the same time, something like that is also another thing that could change Russian public opinion. Mothers of soldiers who've died have always been a very strong political voice. So, we're going to be seeing, the Ukrainian sources are claiming upwards of 3,000 Russian soldiers who are already dead. That's a large voice to potentially speak out against the violence. There are families who have lost their children, who have lost their parents, who have lost their brothers. That's hopefully a voice that's going to get heard and change, I don't know, change the wave of support.
So, Emily, in the last few minutes, since you've studied Ukraine and spent a lot of time there, tell us what you feel is really motivating the Ukrainian people to stand up to the Russians. I mentioned that they're fighting for democracy, but what's your interpretation of what motivates these people to take this brave stand?
Well, I think we saw this in 2014 when they stood up in the Euromaidan protests against the pro-Russian government, and they decided they wanted a different way. And that was democracy, that was independence, that was a European future. So it's not just that people are fighting for this idea, it's that they know that they can do it because they've already done it. They've already done it couple of times. They ousted the pro-Russian leader in 2004. They ousted the Soviet leadership in the 1990s. I mean, these were always, mass mobilizations of people who were willing to fight. So it's both the fact that Ukrainians are fighting for an idea that they have been believing in for years, but also that they have the experience. They know how to do it. They are ready to do it, and they are not going to let whether or not NATO comes to their aid or not, that's not going to be what decides the future of Ukraine. Ukrainians are going to decide the future of Ukraine. And that's really, really, I think, more motivating than maybe we can understand, not having had our country's sovereignty challenged by a much greater power before. Ukrainians fundamentally understand that.
So you're describing something that's not nationalism in the way, certainly in the way that Putin's trying to describe them as a bunch of Nazis. It's not a traditional sort of patriotic nationalism based upon jingoism and often extremism and violence. It seems like a much deeper form of nationalism.
I think it is. And I think one thing that matters a lot is that Ukraine has always been this multi-ethnic country. This identity has been, it's shifted over many years. Obviously, there are more Ukrainians than any other ethnic group in Ukraine. But Ukraine has this idea of being a civic nation. So in 1991, when the Ukrainian state was established, anybody who lived in that territory became a Ukrainian citizen. So that meant ethnic Ukrainians, it meant ethnic Russians, it meant Jews, it meant Romanians, it meant Hungarians, it meant Crimean Tatars, right? All of these people were considered Ukrainian citizens. That's what the vision of Ukraine is to people now. I mean, that was established in the 1990s. That's still the vision that the majority of people see as Ukraine. And that's a democratic Ukraine where everybody gets to participate equally. And I mean, Russian kind of Slavic Brotherhood nationalism is very counter to that idea. It's an imposed imperial idea that creates hierarchies and creates greater kinds of differences between people. And yes, it's a very idealistic vision of the Ukrainian state. We know that there's challenges to that. But I think it's really important to clarify how people see Ukraine as a government, as a state, and that's very different from this kind of Russian imperial idea where, national identity is this hierarchy, and if you're not a white Slavic person, you're lower on the totem pole. Ukraine is not built in that way.
Well, Emily, I thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And again, I've been speaking with Emily Channell-Justice, who's the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine Program at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, a sociocultural anthropologist who has been doing research in Ukraine since 2012. Her current research focuses on political activism and social movements among students and feminists during the 2013-2014 Euromaidan mobilizations. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking into the bogus referendum in Belarus, where the dictator is extending his rule, ending the country's neutrality and nuclear-free zone, and offering his troops up to Putin to fight